17 years. That's how long he gave the company, until they slid a manila envelope across the table and took his badge without a word. But they didn't realize he'd kept everything. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The conference room was cold, impersonal. Mark Renshaw had walked in expecting a restructuring update, something routine after 17 years of loyalty. But the manila envelope on the table told a different story. No smiles, no eye contact, just Lisa from HR, hands folded, and Brad, his supervisor, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Due to economic necessity," Lisa began, her voice rehearsed. Mark heard the rest in fragments: severance, 2 weeks, termination, immediate, return of all property, now. No discussion, no recognition. It wasn't a meeting, it was a silent execution. Mark had started at Edgemont when they still celebrated birthdays with sheet cake. He'd trained half the current staff, stayed through every transition, and never once called in sick. Loyalty had been his currency, but in that moment, it had no value. He opened the envelope with quiet disbelief. The letter inside was templated, cold. The recommendation was generic. The list of career transition resources was insulting. When they asked for his badge, keycard, and laptop, he placed each item on the table with mechanical precision, hands steady, face unreadable. He rose, putting on the same coat he'd worn through a dozen winters in that building. As he reached the door, Lisa added softly, "Mark, I hope you understand this isn't personal." He didn't turn around, didn't nod, didn't speak. Because it was personal. It always had been. Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles above him, the hum like static in his chest. Each night blurred into the next, marked not by sleep, but by silence thick enough to choke. The shock had settled like concrete in his gut, hardened into something darker. This wasn't grief. It was insult layered over erasure. 17 years dismissed in a 10-minute meeting. And that final line, "This isn't personal." That was the part that kept him up. Because to Mark, it was. He hadn't expected applause, but he hadn't expected to be walked out like a stranger either. No transition meeting, no handoff, no farewell email. As if the work he poured his life into had been so interchangeable that once he was gone, the place would hum along without pause. That, more than anything, lit the slow fuse. And then, one night, the fuse caught. A memory, sharp and specific. Spring of 2019. An internal audit had revealed several licensing shortfalls. Mark had flagged it early, detailed memos, escalation emails, even a formal report marked time-sensitive. Leadership skimmed, nodded, and shelved it. They said it would cost too much to fix, and besides, no one ever checks. But Mark had archived everything. He sat up in bed, swung his feet to the floor, and opened the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet beside his desk. Behind tax folders and warranty slips, he found it. A black thumb drive labeled Audit MR19. Still there, still intact. He stared at it in his palm. It was small, unremarkable, but suddenly it felt like weight. Not just evidence, but leverage. Because while Edgemont had erased him, they had also underestimated the one thing he never forgot. Documentation. Mark didn't shout. He didn't write angry posts or call former colleagues in a flurry of bitterness. His response was methodical, not emotional. Rage had cooled into resolve, and resolve sharpened into action. He cleared his dining room table, opened his laptop, and began assembling the pieces like a puzzle only he knew how to finish. Dozens of flagged emails, memos with subject lines like urgent, licensing discrepancies, reports stamped with internal timestamps. Every file was saved, cross-referenced, and placed neatly into a digital folder he labeled Audit Trail. There was no fluff, no editorializing, just proof. When he picked up the phone to call the state licensing authority, his voice was steady, calm. The woman on the line didn't rush him. She listened, asked questions. By the end of the conversation, she gave him a secure upload link. Mark sent everything within the hour. No fanfare followed. No replies, no headlines. Just silence. But it was the kind of silence that carried weight. 3 weeks later, an email landed in his inbox. Subject line, "Request for interview, Regulatory Oversight Division." He read it twice before replying. By then, the wheels had already turned. Edgemont Systems was being investigated. Regulators weren't just curious, they were alarmed. The audit records Mark had provided revealed a pattern of negligence stretching back years. The company hadn't simply overlooked compliance. They had been warned and documented that warning, then chosen to do nothing. Fines came next. Publicly quiet, internally seismic. Leadership meetings were held behind closed doors. Department heads were summoned, asked for explanations. And in the middle of it all, Mark, once escorted out without so much as a handshake, was now being asked to explain what they had failed to understand. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. But when he opened the folder marked Audit Trail to prepare for his interview, he did feel one thing: precision. Mark never raised his voice. He never wrote the scathing expose or replied to the clickbait journalists circling like sharks around Edgemont's implosion. He didn't post threads on LinkedIn or drop cryptic messages meant to stir sympathy. He simply watched, quietly, as the structure that had ejected him began to buckle under the weight of its own shortcuts and arrogance. When the reports hit industry bulletins, it was with dry language: compliance failures, neglect of fiduciary duty, systemic oversight lapses. But the subtext was thunderous. And the people who once dismissed him as background noise, who rushed him out with a folder and a scripted apology, now stood under spotlights, answering questions they were no longer prepared to dodge. Mark read one of those articles while sipping coffee in the kitchen of his apartment. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt right. Not righteous, just aligned, balanced. A week later, an email found its way to his inbox. It wasn't flashy. No emojis, no breathless tone, just a note from a recruiter at a well-regarded software firm. "We came across your compliance testimony. Would love to talk. We value people who act with integrity, especially when it's hard." The offer came quickly. More pay, a leadership role, flexible hours, a team built on transparency. He didn't hesitate. Mark didn't tell anyone from Edgemont where he landed. He didn't need the last word. He had let the bridge fall on its own and walked away without ashes on his hands. He'd been labeled a liability. Now he was sought after. He'd been cast aside quietly. Now his silence echoed louder than any accusation. He didn't win a war. He just stood still long enough for the truth to speak.